Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi wa kafa. Salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'ada wa ba'ad. Alhamdulillah. Today we're looking at the 13th going into the 14th of Rabi' Al-Akhir. 13th going into the 14th of Rabi' Al-Akhir. Now today, normally we would return back to our hadith class, but some events have occurred in the world such that require us to take a look at another topic today, inshallah. The incursions, the continued Israeli incursions into the West Bank have brought them very close to some very old crypts in the areas of Nablus and the surrounding villages. And as we know, Nablus is a major staging ground. Palestine is a major staging ground. And all of this comes after they made the decision of the land for peace deal. Those of us that remember at the time where Ariel Sharon was the Israeli prime minister, and he made the land for peace deal, and he forcibly extracted Israeli settlers from locations in Gaza as well as in parts of the West Bank. Not long after that time, he was felled by a very severe stroke, which kept him in a nearly vegetative state up until the time that he died, maybe 5 years ago or so. Since that time that there have been prime ministers after him, they have been unraveling much of the land for peace work that they've done and accelerating the process of building settlements. One of these locations is in the West Bank, and Nablus is located in the West Bank. Now, the threats that there are to the local graveyards are very serious indeed. And this is partially why fighting has been so intense, not just on the part of Muslims in the area, but Christians as well, and also Samaritans, as well as even some of the Palestinians that are Jews, because there are Palestinian Jews. So I want to give a backdrop of the history of Palestine, and then to walk us up to the entrance of Islam into the area. And then I want to give the names of two major figures and some in-between scholars. Those of us that have had or have a bookshelf know that a bookshelf needs bookends. Because if you don't have bookends, the books fall down or the spine gets damaged or whatever else. In terms of Palestinian history, I would say that there are two bookends. The first bookend is Imam Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi. And we'll be mentioning him later. The first bookend is Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi. And he died 487 Hijri. Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi. Now the second bookend comes, it is Imam Muhammad As-Safarini. I would call him the second bookend. The reason why I've put these two as bookends is that Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi coming into Palestine as a traveling missionary and theologian led to mass conversions to Islam among Palestinians. When you get to the time of Imam al-Safarini, you're talking about a tradition that goes back to Ash-Shirazi, and in terms of hadith, fiqh, and other things, most people are going back through the channel of al-Safarini. Major figure, both are major figures, authorities in their time. So let's now take a look then at the overview of history on the topic of Palestine. I want to go back perhaps 4,400 years. This brings us to, on the pagan calendar, 2200 BC. Now, in this time, the Palestinian territories and Jordan and Israel are one land. They are one land. This land is ruled by a people known as the Canaanites. The Canaanites although this word sounds unfamiliar because it's coming from Arabic, those that might be familiar with English might be familiar with the term Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians, at that point in history, have substantial territories in the Mediterranean. The scope of their maritime influence, because they were mainly a seafaring people, the scope of their maritime influence extends to the area that we referred to, Palestine, Jordan, and Israel, over to Libya. And in Libya, there's a site that's in ruins known as Carthage. Site in Libya known as Carthage. It's in ruins today. Those people are called Carthaginians. These people and the Phoenicians are related. Some say they're the same people. Some say that they're coming from similar stock, but they have unique aspects to themselves. A good book that will start you off on this topic. It is thick, but a good book that will start you off on the topic. The name of the author slips my mind, but the book's title is Carthage Must Be Destroyed. This is a history of dealings between Rome and Carthage. The Roman perceptions of the Carthaginians, the Carthaginian perceptions of themselves as well as Romans. One of the great war generals of history, Hannibal. If you remember, he walked African elephants across a thin ledge in order to march them against his Roman enemies. He was a Carthaginian. So, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, these people are related. So when you hear people being referred to as Phoenicians or Carthaginians, It's these people. Most of the people that occupy Lebanon today are Phoenicians. They're not racially Arabs, although the official language is Arabic. They are Phoenician. Right? So Firas Zahabi is the trainer, the main trainer. He is a Phoenician. He's Lebanese, although he's Christian, but he's an example of a Phoenician or Carthaginian. Now, the Romans ultimately Rome, through warfare and wars of attrition, ultimately winds up destroying Carthage down to its foundations. And the people are either exterminated or brought back to Rome as slaves. There were attempts by their Phoenician progeny to beat the Romans, but it was too much. And a new era was dawning, the Roman era. And they required more land troops because the Romans aren't going to sea. They're fighting land battles. The Phoenicians and Carthaginians are maritime. They didn't have enough troops to sustain a full-scale land war. Another thing that was also happening at that time, and when I'm saying Roman, because we're talking about 2000 BC. Now, someone would say, wait a second. The Romans, as we know them as a civilization, didn't come around until around 700 BC, whatever else. Well, yes, I'm talking about Romans in the sense of the Hellenistic civilization of the Greeks. So when I'm talking about the Romans, I'm including the Greeks and the Romans in this sense. Because the Romans come around 753 BC, Remus and Romulus, the city of Rome gets built. But I'm talking about, in this sense, the Greeks leading on to the succession of the Romans over the Greeks. Another problem that the Carthaginians and Phoenicians had to contend with was the Aramean Empire. And the Aramean Empire is an empire that had its seat in Iraq and ruled over most of the Fertile Crescent. So the Fertile Crescent, talking about, some would include today's Turkey, big chunks of the Middle East, parts of North Africa. The Aramean Empire extends over. So Aramean becomes a lingua franca language. Now the Carthaginians, Phoenicians, and Arameans are related. These are all what are called Semitic people, meaning they're coming from a common ancestor, which is Sam. Right? So they're related, so their languages are almost mutually intelligible to one another, but their cultures are different. So the Arameans take over and begin to run things. Around this time, 2000 BC, Nabiyuna Ibrahim alayhi salam leaves Iraq. He sees a vision, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him to leave. So the country that he had lived in was Iraq. He leaves with his wife, Sarah alayhi salam, and he moves to a place called Haran, which is in today's Syria. Haran. The place stands today. So he moves to a place called Haran in today's Syria. His next set of instructions are to then move on from there. Now remember, this is 2000 BC on the pagan calendar. He goes to a spot outside of where the city of Jerusalem would later be built. This area is known as Machpelah. Maqbala, and he buys the plot of land there, which is where he will eventually be interred when he dies, alayhi salam. It's outside of the walls of Jerusalem. It's called Maqbala. So when Nabiyyuna Ibrahim alayhi salam dies, he and Sarah are buried there. And this particular period is during the Bronze Age. So during the Bronze Age, the sun begins to set on the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians. The Arameans are holding sway during this Bronze Age. Around 600 BC of the pagan calendar, the Nabateans make an appearance onto the scene. And the Nabateans are the children of the first son of Nabiyyuna Ismail alayhi salam. The Nabateans. A very good book on this topic, again, hefty. It's by Phillip al-Khoury Hitti, and it's called The History of the Arabs. There's a discussion of the Nabateans. Okay. So the Nabateans began to move into the areas where the Phoenicians are in what is Palestine, Jordan, and Israel. And this is the beginning, some would say, of intermingling between Arabs and the people that are in that land, the Phoenician people that are there. There starts to be intermingling between these peoples. Some Arabs marry amongst each other, while some Arabs marry into these Phoenician people. Examples of interchange between these people, examples of it linguistically, Arabic-wise, will be the use of the word shu to mean what. Shu hada, what is this? Shu is what in Phoenician and also Carthaginian and Canaanite. It's not Arabic. Shu is not. What is ma. This is an example of this. The dal and hada being deleted and having in its place a dal put. These are examples of the fact that these are people that are Phoenicians, that are using these things. Arameans as well. So during this time where Phoenician obviously is still spoken by the people, the lingua franca that you're learning in school is going to be Aramean. So they're going to learn Aramean. And by learning Aramean, that's going to mix with whatever language you have. Just like people who their first language is French and they're in a completely English-speaking environment. They're going to have leftovers of their language that bleeds into pieces of their L1, which is their mother tongue, bleed into their L2, which is their language that they're learning. The Greeks then began the process of taking over the Mediterranean. So by this time, Carthaginians have been vanquished. Phoenicians are unable to assist them. And one man comes out of the ashes of this, and his name is Alexander the Greek, who is the son of Philip the Macedonian. Alexander the Greek is known to us as Alexander the Great because he's the first ruler to hold the name Alexander. People often assume that Alexander the Great means it's some statement regarding his virtue. It's got nothing to do with him being a great man or being noble. Alexander the Great just means he's the first one of his dynasty. Just like you'll see in old English histories, it'll say John the Lesser and John the Great. The lesser means he's the younger one. The greater means he's the eldest. Right? So the great just means he's the first. So Alexander the Great takes over the entire Mediterranean, and also in a cue from the Persians, because he's able to defeat the Persians, who at this time had become, they were on the way to becoming like how America was. He decides to defeat them, and he builds outward this Greek civilization. He takes over Egypt, and he begins to Hellenize as much as possible the Mediterranean. He builds the city of Alexandria in Egypt, walls off the city, puts the great classics of Greek literature and ancient Egyptian literature and other literatures of the Phoenicians and other people in that library. So Greek becomes the language that people should learn. Eventually, that form of Greek, after the death of Alexander the Great in 332 BC, that gives way to another type of Greek, which is entitled Koine Greek. Koine Greek, Koine. An example of Koine Greek is the language that the New Testament for the Christians is written in. So that kind of takes hold, this form of Greek, as the lingua franca of that area. Aramean gives way. The Romans, not long after that, take over where the Greeks left off at. And they extend their empire further. The Romans then become Christians during the time of Constantine, also called the Great, because he's the first of his empire, not because it's a statement on his virtue. Christianity then spreads. And the spread of Christianity comes to the Palestinians, the people that are in this land. And so they're doing, because they're using Koine Greek as a language and not Latin, Greek is still seen as the language of learning and culture. But they're using the vernacular, their everyday speech, in either Aramean or their own language, Phoenician. Whatever Nabateans are there are using Aramean and in their own Arabic. The Christianity that reaches them will be based upon what is from their actual area. So, by this time, the city of Jerusalem stands. The city of Beit Lahem, or Bethlehem in English, there's one of the most important sites of Christendom sits there. In Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre will become the second most revered portion for Christians. Second most revered spot for Christians in the world. So, by the time of the Great Schism, in years after this, there's already a very entrenched, rich Christian tradition among these Palestinians, as we'll call them. Now, the word Palestine, or Philistine, the first instance we have of this being used is by the Romans. And they named Philistine, they named it this after a province within their kingdoms. So the Romans broke the world up into provinces, and that area was called Philistine, and they referred to the people from there as Philistines, or Philistinians. And that's what they named those people. And that was a catch-all term for all these different people that lived in that area but had a similar culture or an agreed upon culture. In the year 580 AD, pagan calendar, 580 AD 580, a split occurs between what we would later call the Latin rite of Christianity and the other churches over liturgy and some of it Christology. The Arabs, whether in Palestine or the other people within that area, ran churches that are known as, it's a fancy word, but churches that are known as autocephalous. Autocephalous just means auto, to be by itself, to move automatically. Cephalus, head. So it meant that each church has its own patriarch, which means that they're outside of the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Rome, who by this time said that he's the universal patriarch over all churches. They said, no, we're our own patriarch. So they have services not in Greek or Latin, in their own language. It's Phoenician. The Copts of Egypt are having services in Coptic. Arameans are having services in Aramean. Latvians are having services in Latvian. Serbians are having services in Serbian. Because for them, the point is understanding the services. And especially, you're not going to tell the people of the land of Palestine, you're not going to tell them, who are the people among who Nabiyuna Isa alayhi salam's message spread in Aramean, that they need to do their services in Greek, and their lingua franca is Aramean, which is one of the languages that he would have spoken. So they carry on. During this time, this distinct form of Arab Christianity, especially the Palestinians, developed a monastic tradition. Now, their monastic tradition is different to the monastic tradition of the Latin Church. The Latin Church monastic tradition was, if someone wanted to be a priest, they had to forswear women. You couldn't get married. If you wanted to become a monk, you couldn't get married. You compulsorily forsook marriage and family life. That's not the case for the churches in Palestine and other places. They had a long-term tradition of monks. And they began to practice a very rigorous and worship-centered form of Christianity called Justinian monasticism. Very rigorous form of Christianity. So they deprived themselves of the finer foods. They lived in communities in which they took on vows of poverty. Some of them might be married, some of them might not be. But they were very particular. And it is this was the state of the Mediterranean at the time that the first Muslims marched out of Arabia. This is the state. So I wanted to set the table here so that you can understand this is the state of play at the time that the Arabs that had become Muslim step out of the peninsula. So they're stepping into a world in which, even if people are Arabs, they're Christians, and they consider it noble, upstanding, and an educated thing to do to speak Greek. If you don't know Greek, you must not be educated. You must be some type of heathen or ruffian. You have to know Greek, because that's the language of culture and literature and science and math. That was the thinking. Now, they arrive in Palestine in the Khilafah of Omar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. They arrive around the year of 15 or 16 years after the Hijrah. they arrive in the Khilaf of Omar. When they arrive, the head patriarch of the Arab church meets Omar. Now, I want you to listen to this because this is very important. When the patriarch of the Arab church meets Omar, he mistakes him for a monk initially. Because he saw the patched clothing, because Omar radiallahu anhu would wear his thobe, but he would patch it. So he had 20 patches on his thobe. So when he saw Omar, he thought he must be a monk of whatever religion he's bringing. He must be some type of monk. And this caused an attachment. Because initially when they saw Omar from a distance, they thought this man's come to bring destruction and devastation. But when they came close to him, they thought this man must be some type of monk. Then they saw the Muslims that were Arabs worshipping, and they thought they're monks of some sort. And so that then brought them to ask more questions. They even were allowing Omar to pray. They said, please, pray in our church. He said, I cannot do that because anywhere Omar prays becomes a masjid. So this was the beginning of the interface between the Muslims that had arrived and the people that were in that land. Omar came to the place where Masjid Al-Aqsa sits today. The Masjid Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock sit on a huge plot of acreage known as Mount Moriah. Big plot of acreage. The Christians of that time period, the Greek and Latin Rite, left the area in complete disrepair because their understanding was that because the temple had been destroyed, the second temple in 70 AD, and the Romans had destroyed it, you should leave it in desolation. Shouldn't be cleaned off. But as Muslims, we had a different understanding because the night journey had happened. The Prophet ﷺ had been there. And he had prayed with all the prophets there. So our understanding of that area was completely different. So Omar orders that the place that had now had a built-up trash heap in one corner, that they move all the rubble and the trash from that area. And it's at this point that you see the beginnings of the construction of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, which is, at that point, is going to be small to just incorporate the companions that will be based there. Companions that will be based in Jerusalem would be like Umar ibn al-Khattab. For a period of time he was there. Shaddad ibn Aus. Shaddad ibn Aus was there. In fact, the Aus and the Khazraj in huge numbers came to Palestine. And we know the Aus and the Khazraj are from Al-Madinah. So they came there in very large numbers. And so did some of the people from the Adawi clan. And they're also important because the Adawi clan are a subset of the Quraysh. So I'll say that again. So some of the tribes that came there are the Aus and the Khazraj, which are Ansar, right? Muslims, the helpers. And then you have the Adawi. Some of the Adawi people came there. And the Adawi are a subset of the Quraysh. They're a subset of Quraysh. This is Omar's clan, radiallahu anhu. He's Adawi. Right? This will come in handy to know this information a little bit later. Now, we'll skip ahead to the period of the Bani Umayyah. When we come to the period of the Bani Umayyah ruling over that area, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he wants to do more with that section. So he makes Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, he extends it and makes it more bountiful and more beautiful. But he also builds another structure which is known as Al-Qubbatu Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock. It's actually not a masjid per se. It's what's known as a meshhed, a shrine or a location. It commemorates an event that happened somewhere. So that gold structure that you see with the gold dome, that is the Dome of the Rock. That spot is held to be the spot where he arrived at, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and where he did the ascension from. And it's where the rock that he is supposed to have ascended from is also kept there as a relic. So that's built. And if you ever get an opportunity to read the Arabic that goes around, there's been so many documentaries done. All the ayat there are the ayat from Surah Al-Isra. Praise, glory be to the one who took his slave at night from Masjid al-Haram to Masjid al-Aqsa, and so on and so forth. Those are those ayat. Now, obviously, under those is going to be a frieze, like an inscription, which is going to bear the name of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, who began this noble project. May Allah ennoble him and lengthen his shadow, and there's all these other types of things. And then, not far from there inside the building is another phrase of the person who completed it. This was completed by the Khalifa of the Bani Umayyad in this year. May Allah lengthen his shadow and forgive him and increase his rank and his children, his progeny from now forevermore. Ameen, ameen, and all that good stuff. Right. So, he extends this area and now it's built up. Now, during this time, people are becoming Muslim, but it's a drizzle. It's a drizzle during this time. Because the missionary spirit that Omar and the others had was not in the Bani Umayyah. The Bani Umayyah, most of those rulers were not encouraging people to become Muslim. They weren't encouraging a lot of people to become Muslim. And what they did is they set up what was known as the Mawali system. So when someone became Muslim, they were Mawla of someone else, which normally Mawla means freed slave. And so when Muslims who were converts found out that were non-Arabs that it meant freed slave, they thought, wait a minute. I thought this man was supposed to be looking after me and vouching for me, but now he's become the proof that I'm Muslim because I've converted through an Arab Muslim. That's not right. So there started to be rebellions and other problems. Now, in the Palestinian territories, these people are mostly Arabs, and if they're not, they're closely related to the Arabs through being linked to them through some other way. So they were taking jizya from them. They weren't using the Mawla system on them, but they weren't encouraging them to become Muslim. And so a lot of people just stayed as they were. There weren't even really debates. The churches stayed as they were. Other affairs stayed as they were. Then the Bani al-Abbas took over in the year 132 Hijri. Then they take over. And the Bani al-Abbas change everything in terms of missionary activity. But they become too aggressive. And when the Justinian Christians of Palestine try to debate, they get killed. Because Abdullah Al-Abbasi, his title is known as As-Safah, the bloodshedder. He's not here to debate. You become Muslim, and that's it. So he fights the innovators in that fashion. And then he also fights the Christians in that fashion. But wait a minute, what do you say about Christ? Does he have one nature or two natures? Well, the hilt of my sword has but one nature. Become Muslim. And they take the hadith literally, although it's not its intent. The hadith aslim taslim, which means become Muslim and you will be saved. They read it, their understanding of reading means become Muslim and surrender. Meaning stop. Just lay down arms. That's it for you. So this creates a problem. And so people are still becoming Muslim, but it's a drizzle. During this time, we have one of the major figures of history, Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la Al-Baghdadi. Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la Al-Baghdadi in Baghdad. So I'm going to start to link this together, why this is important. We're coming to our first bookend. Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la Al-Baghdadi, who dies 458 Hijri. So, Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la Al-Baghdadi, who dies 458 Hijri, he has more than 40 students. Each one is a marja. We're talking major figures. If we just sat down and spoke just about those 40 students that were all muraja, that could be a separate class in and of itself. It could be several classes, actually. Because the foothold that Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la had as marja in his time, his ability to stop the conflict that was occurring between the Bani al-Abbas rulers and the marja people, and how the muraja were brought from exile back into their rightful place, deserves a separate presentation. Out of his many different students, he has one of them who is described as a theologian and a Sufi of high standing. This one is Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi. Now, we want to speak about him. He's our first bookend. Ibn Rajab mentions him in volume 3 of his Tabaqat. Ibn Rajab mentions him in volume 3 of his Tabaqat. And in volume 3 of his Tabaqat, under entry 28. Entry 28. He describes the Imam as his name is Abdul Wahid ibn Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Ahmed Ash-Shirazi Al-Maqdisi. His kunya is Abu al-Faraj. And he is a direct descendant of Sa'ad ibn Ubadah. Who is from the Khazraj who was from the Khazraj clan. And was an Ansari. So we have the very beginnings of this Imam that we've been given. It is this Imam who is a theologian and itinerant preacher and described as a Sufi, who will be traveling into the Palestinian territories. Let me mention a few salient points about him. His family, although they're Arabs, they lived in Shiraz, in Iran. Now, in the fourth age, after Iraq, Iran was one of the happening places to be if you wanted to study medicine, if you wanted to study fiqh. That was one of the happening places to be. Shiraz, Maro, Gilan, right? Tus, right? These were places where, even as an Arab, you wanted to be because there were major things going on intellectually. However, Abul Faraj Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi, he was born in the city of Haran. Now that's very significant because this is the place where Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam touched down when he left Iraq. So he was born in Haran. The Ibn Taymiyyah family are from Haran. Ibn Hamdan, who died 695 Hijri, he's from Haran. That place has not failed to give us scholars. So for the past 4,000 years, it's just been doling out people to us. So, Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi, he begins his life memorizing the Quran, studying at the feet of some of the scholars of his locale. He moves to Baghdad. So he starts off in Haran. He moves to Baghdad. Now that's not as big of a move as you might think, because someone says, oh, that's huge. Yes, but the way that Iraq is based, with Sham just under it, is a ride that's not out of the question. It's commutable, even by pack animal. So he leaves from Haran and moves to Iraq, and has the opportunity to sit with the formidable Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la al-Baghdadi. So he learns fiqh, theology, Tafsirah of the Quran, and he sits with many different scholars. But his main work was with Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la. When he is told that he is now an authority in the religion, he's then commanded to go out and to preach to the world. So he does. He leaves from Iraq, goes into Sham, and finds his way to Jerusalem. And it is while there that he begins to preach the faith to Christians, to Jews, and mass conversions start to take place. And so because he's based in Jerusalem, he winds up with the title of Al-Maqdisi. Jerusalem is known as Bayt al-Maqdis in Arabic, winds up with the title of Al-Maqdisi. So these mass conversions take place. Now something huge happens. He goes to the city of Nablus, which years ago had been called Shechem in Hebrew. Shechem. And after being called Shechem, it's called another word in either Greek or Roman. That's either pronounced nebula or nebula. The Arabs, not being fluent in Greek and Roman, say Nablus. He arrives there, and he arrives at this huge Justinian monastery with monks. They ask him to debate, to which he says, I'm not going to do that. Are you afraid? His response was no. But a debate presupposes that truth is in question. Truth is not in question. I've come to bring it to you. But you may query and question me as much as you so choose, and I am duty bound to answer your questions if I know the answer. Immediately, he's presented with his own table, and the crowd begins to draw to ask questions. And he's answering his questions. Now, for those of you that remember, spoiler alert, this runs the same way of what happens in Duma, if you remember when we did our presentation on Duma, because they're coming from that monastery and the big church and everything else. The people wind up taking on board what he says, and they're affected in such a major way, there is a mass conversion. That church gets converted into a masjid. And now Islam starts to really spread among the Palestinians. They ask him, give us some piece of literature that we can adhere to as a method of practice. Because he'd given them the Quran, he'd given them the Sunnah, but they said, give us some, because you have to remember, these are Justinian Christians. They're used to having the Athanasian Creed, all these creeds that tell them these are the things that we have to believe. They're used to having their hours where they have hours of silence that they have to have in the day, hours of this, hours of that. So they've learned fiqh, they've learned some other things, right? Because he's brought his madhab with him, he's brought theology, but they want something, some type of system. So he writes a book. The book is called At-Tabsirah. At-Tabsirah. The book he writes is At-Tabsirah fi us-Saalih. At-Tabsirah fi us-Saalih. Which it is in translation, the meaning is the clear insight in the foundations of the religion. At-Tabsirah fi usul ad-din. So people take that book, and he writes another 4 books. One in fiqh, because they're quite curious about fiqh, and the people stand by those books. They then build a big house for him to stand, which is like a vicarage almost in appearance. If you've ever seen a picture of a vicarage where a vicar stays, when you come to visit us, you stay here. And he said, oh, well, I'll stay here with you. So he stays on for years and years and years. And the impact of that Justinian Christian movement being transformed, the impact of that event, the shockwave of that is felt throughout the rest of the area. Because Nablus is not far from Jerusalem, so that's felt. And the villages around Jerusalem, there are all these other villages around Jerusalem that are also impacted. Villages like Jama'il, Safarin, Marda, Ramin. All these villages that are around there are villages that become important later because they become part of incorporated Nablus. That being said, though, he becomes this huge figure. Then something else starts to happen. He's declared the Imam for the people. They declare him their Imam in fiqh and in theology. And they become rather stringent. They become rather stringent in theology and in fiqh. They become very stringent because they're used to this being Justinians. Become rather strict and stringent. Then the next thing after that is opponents began to come from other areas of the Palestinian territories to try to challenge him, some with an intent to kill him, and then all of these different karramat start to happen. And these karramat, and karramat are wonders of, a wali of Allah has wonders that happen to him. He doesn't do them, but they happen involuntarily. So a prophet does a mu'jiza, a prophet does a miracle, because the people challenge him and he produces something. The karama happens to the wali. He's not trying to, he's not looking to do it, but it happens. So all of these karramat start happening. Karramat that save his life. Karramat where people that needed food for all of a sudden are given sustenance from ways they didn't have it before. People who were planning on doing him harm are stopped at the last minute, or their swords go dull. You know, really, really unusual stuff. And a sword going dull suddenly, that's a huge event. If you've sharpened your sword, you've looked after it, it can't all of a sudden go dull. You know, even chefs will tell you if you take a sharp knife and you run it over cold water for too many times, over time it will dull, but a sword does not suddenly become dull. So he becomes known for his work among these people. And as the karramat spread, so does the love of the people for him. He sat in gatherings in which there were thousands of people. And those thousands of people were composed of students, followers, and even 9-year-old boys. Around this time, there then appeared people who started trying to bring in speculative theology. So the Ash'aris began to appear. And he warned them to avoid this because you didn't want the people to become confused. But the Ash'ari insisted. They accused Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi of likening Allah with his creation because he wouldn't affirm some of the doctrines. And the people of the area tried to kill all of the Ash'ari. Unfortunately, they escaped. The Ash'ari escaped. And to this day, that area, there are no Ash'ari in that area. He wrote another number of books on the clarification of certain things before he decided to head out and to visit Sham. When the Imam visited Sham, the first place he stopped was north of Damascus. It's a small city called, well, a good-sized place called Ruhba. And you'll remember this if you remember the big Marja Mustafa Ruhaybani, who's from there. Some major scholars from there. So he starts to talk about Islam there, spread Islam there. Duma's not far from there, so they've already had missionaries come there. He starts in Ruhba. Damascus becomes a major center of learning and has been by the time he reaches there. His careful attention to detail also leads him to go back and forth to Iraq. And he stops in a place known as Hitti. And he winds up having several hundred students. And Hitti in Iraq is in Anbar province. Major Muraji are from there now. One of his wonders was one of the tyrannical governors of his time tried to send assassins against him. And the Imam made dua against him. And he died on the spot. He preached frequently in his gatherings, and he warned people to stay away from topics that couldn't benefit them and affairs that would be harmful to them. In the year 486 Hijri, Imam Al-Shirazi dies in Damascus. But the Palestinian people build almost like a meshhed, like a shrine, in remembrance of all of his work he's done. They took sort of the vicarage that they built, something looking like a vicarage, and made that into like a shrine to where people visit. It's big, it's green with yellow stripes on it. It's still there, unless it's been destroyed in some of the fighting, but it's still there. And it's a namesake and remembrance of this huge figure that was responsible for these mass conversions of Palestinians. He is also one of the material sources for the scholarship of another man, whose name is Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Qudama. Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Qudama is the father of the well-known Marja people, such as Muwafiquddin and others. So he's one of the material sources for them. Now, Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Qudama, they are from the Adawi clan, which are Quraysh. They're direct descendants of Omar, radiallahu anhu. And so because of Imam Shirazi's barakah, what he left behind, they then drank from that same pool, from all those sciences. And it's mentioned in the volume that I quoted from, the Tabaqat, that Muwafiq al-Din al-Muqaddama, he used to say that all of us forever belong to the barakah of Imam Shirazi. Meaning that his clan, the Qudama, families, like all of us are forever. We belong to the barakah of Imam Shirazi. Like he's the cause of us having the blessing. So when we think about Imam Muwafiq al-Din al-Qudama, his greatness, his elder brother, all these other people, it's like that's only possible as far as they're concerned because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving them Imam Shirazi. Right? And he is around the same time. So if you want to understand, to put him in perspective, so he dies 486 Hijri, okay? You want to look at him in perspective, then you want to understand that he is the era of scholars before Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. Right? So you're looking at a situation in which you have Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani dying 561 Hijri. This Imam dies 486. So the sheikhs that Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani looks up to are the students of this sheikh. So he is the grand sheikh of Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. That's his sheikh. So the barakah of this Imam makes it possible for the Banu Qudama and all the other jama'at that come after to spread. And as the family spread, people intermarry, because Muslims, if a man and a woman marry, and the man is Muslim, but the woman was Orthodox Christian, even if she doesn't become Muslim, the children certainly will be. And if you come from an environment in which you've heard of mass conversions at the Justinian church up the road from you, that's going to impact you. Because the men at that Justinian place are monks, and they're not laymen. A monk for an Orthodox Christian that's an Arab is a theologian. He's a scholar already. So these are people that know their own language, they know their own religion, they know their tradition. So for them to convert in mass is substantial. It's substantive. It's huge. The implications of that are unprecedented. And so this was the beginning of Islam spreading in a systematic way that was like a wildfire. That's our first bookend. Our second bookend then comes after hundreds of years of scholarship from this area. All the Palestinian scholars we can think of, right? Muwafiq al-Din al-Qudama, his brother Abu Omar, his younger one Ibn Imad, Alauddin al-Mardawi, who's another one, he dies 885, the Ibn Muflih family, so many of these Palestinian, Mir ibn Yusuf al-Karmi, right? All these people are made possible by the sacrifice of one man. And out of that one man's tree, all these other trees grow. And it's the same thing with a seed. You see a set of trees that are together in one system. It all started from one seed. And that seed was thrown, put in the ground, and watered. And out of that grew this massive set of trees. But the root system is all interconnected. So we talk about our second bookmark. Our second bookend comes about at a very crucial time. His name is Muhammad ibn Ahmed ibn Salim ibn Sulaiman. His laqab is Shamsuddin. And his kunya is Abul Aoun. He was born in the year 1114. 1114. In the village of Safarin. Safarin is considered part of Nablus. It's a village surrounding Nablus. So again, he's part of this Barakah. He memorized the Quran just under 11 years of age. So finished the Quran just under 11. He was close to 11 years old, finished the Quran. Perfected his tajweed. And when he reached adulthood, just 15, he headed out to Damascus. So he left from the Palestinian territories and went to Syria. And he decided to study at the Umayyah family central masjid, Jami Bani Umayyah. The Umayyah family central masjid. That big mammoth masjid in Damascus, one of the 4 largest in the Muslim world. That big mammoth masjid is also a school. So he went to study there. He learned from a vast array of scholars. And one of the most important was a man named Abdul Qadir ibn Omar At-Taghlabi. Abdul Qadir ibn Omar At-Taghlabi. He died 1133. He is one of the commentators on Al-Karmi's fiqh text, Abdul Qadir ibn Umar al-Taghlabi. And he also studied with the Imam Mustafa ibn Abdul Haq. Mustafa ibn Abdul Haq al-Labadi, who was related to Abdul Ghani al-Labadi. Kafr Labad is often called, and Kafr Labad is another Palestinian territory. It's out just outside of Nablus. It's called the Village of Scholars because their scholarship is so precise and so overwhelming. So he learns from him. he learns from one of the children of one of the great Imams. He takes bay'ah into the Khalwati tariqah. Khalwati is a abbreviated form of the Qadri tariqah. Now, in this time, and the Imam mentions this in his books, that a lot of innovation starts to occur where people get put into khalwa. So someone comes and they give bay'ah to the sheikh, and the sheikh says, okay, I'm going to put you in khalwa for 40 days. Don't come out. So they're taken into a room, maybe this size, maybe smaller, and put into khalwa. They're not to leave that location, not do anything. They're just to focus on dhikr and so on and so forth. Now, some people, if they're put in an environment where there's no physical stimuli, sometimes those people, they either go insane or they have hallucinations or they have an episode. So people will get put in that situation, undergo some type of hallucination and think that, oh, this is a message from Allah to me. And it is a message from Allah to you that you need medical help and that you shouldn't be in a room where you have no physical stimulation. That's a message to Allah from you. But it's not a message that you've undergone some deep spiritual trillings. It's not that at all. So, also there were people who would voluntarily go into khalwa where they said, okay, well, I want to spend more time worshiping Allah the Exalted and so on and so forth. But people wound up neglecting their household duties. People wound up neglecting their family obligations. So the Khalwati, particularly Imam Mustafa Al-Bakri, he said, don't do that. Now he died in 1133. He said, 1134, excuse me. He said, don't do that. Instead, use Friday as your biggest and most important day of khalwa. So you should do your most azkar that you'll ever do in the week on Friday. Let that be your khalwa. So someone will do Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'een 300 times. La ilaha illallah 1,000 times. Right? Surah Al-Kahf. Praying Salat al-Tasbih every Friday. Right? Reciting Surah Al-Dukhan, Surah Al-Mulk, and Surah Hamim Sajda every day before you go to sleep. And there's ahadith for all these things. Right? So he's saying, listen, do these things. Instead of trying to go into khalwa in a situation where you actually damage yourself, try to do these things because they're all possible and they're all feasible. See, the key to taking on any greater state, even if it's one where someone says, oh, I want to lift more weight or I want to do so and so. Okay. The key to doing that is to create milestones and challenges that aren't above what you're able to accomplish, but it's enough of a challenge to where you don't become bored with it. And so some of the tariqas in his time, there were a group in his time that were called the Al-Azadiqa, the blue men. This is in the time of this Imam. And the blue men, what they would do is they would, as a way of seeking purification, try to humiliate themselves in front of Allah so that their sins get forgiven. And part of that included growing their beards long without grooming and hair long without grooming and disrobing. So these men, these blue men, would go around the people and they'd be stark naked. And this was a way of humiliating themselves because the people would shout at them, why are you naked? And they would chase them. And they would say, this is a sign from Allah that our dua is being accepted, our sins are being forgiven because we're being punished by the people. And that's what we deserve, is to be humiliated. And so they would thank the people and please humiliate me. I deserve to be punished. Right? So the Imam had to contend with these types of innovations. He had to contend with innovations where people would say, they began doing a practice known as Rabita. Rabita. Rabita, also known as Taswir al-Sheikh, right, is where the Sheikh, in quotes, would tell the murid or the follower when you are making dhikr of Allah, envision me, it will help you focus. And so there begins to be this blending of where the slave of Allah starts finding difficulty in separating between Allah and the Shaykh. And when someone came to Imam Safarini with this point to say, what do I do in this situation? He said, because he was saying it as if it was something noble and praiseworthy, like, the Shaykh and Allah, they blended together, and now I see no difference. And he said, no, this is major shirk. You must expunge your heart of this. You must get rid of this. This is major shirk. So he had to contend with these things. And Mustafa al-Bakri was among those to assist him in this noble cause. Now, after the year 1153, the Imam by this time is a marja figure. He's in his 40s. After the year 1153, around the 1160s, he receives a big bulk letter. And the bulk letter is from the Muslims that are in Arabia, that are undergoing tribulations in the Najd region regarding the rise of Salafiyah. While he's busy reading through this letter, he receives another letter from a man identifying himself as Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab, inviting him to pure Tawheed, to forsake major shirk and associating partners with Allah, to take the testimony of faith, to believe in Allah, His books, His messengers. He's been invited to Islam. So, seeing that the founder of this organization sent him a letter, and then he's received letters from people on the backdrop of this, he then writes 2 books of theology, which become 4 volumes. The first book is known and shortened as the Lawami', and the Imam does something unique. He takes the Lum'a creed text, the Balbani creed text, and the Nihaya creed text, as well as Ibn Qa'id al-Najdi's creed text, and he boils them all down into a rhyming text. That's around 9 pages. And then on his own poetry, his own rhyming text, he makes this big 2-volume commentary. He then takes a creed text by the son of Imam Abu Dawood, who wrote the Sunan, Abu Bakr ibn Abi Dawood. And he writes a commentary on that, which is 1 page, that small creed text, but the commentary is 2 volumes. He does this between Dhuhr and Asr in the summer. The next day, these books start to get sent out by courier. The Imam then has accomplished this task. He is only the second person to have written a commentary on the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, which is 30,000 ahadith. He's only the second person to have done this. Well, the first actually. The second was Ahmad as-Sa'ati. Imam Safarini was the first. In addition to this, he's fighting wars, because the man who had invited him to Islam is launching attacks. So he has to also contend with intellectual wars, spiritual wars. He has to contend with all these things. Now, he's spending 16 hours of his day teaching classes. Classes on fiqh, classes on creed, classes on hadith, classes on history. He has an absolutely prodigious teaching schedule. A teaching schedule that would kill most men today. And he still found time to make jihad. He is the grand sheikh to the Qadumis and the Shattis, the Qadumi and Shatti families. He's the grand sheikh to them. Because one of his students is Isa al-Qadumi, who's the father of the Qadumis, and the Qadumis taught the Shattis. So he is the father of them. And through the hadith chains and all the other things that have come down through us, we've reached him. And they reach back to him. I've had the pleasure of reading the vast majority of his books, if not all of them. There's only one book I have not read by him. There used to be two. But someone recently published, using the manuscripts, one of those two. And it is this book, Al-Ajwibatu al-Najdiyya an al-As'ilat al-Najdiyya. Najdi answers to Najdi questions. And the book is 8 questions. The final one is yet another scathing rebuke to Muhammad Abdul Wahab. But the first 7 deal with questions such as, did all the other nations pray Salah in the way that we pray it? Why do we have the Salah, Ruku? Why is it in the order? What's the wisdom and why it's in that order? What's the wisdom of that? And when the earth is transformed and the universe and creation will be destroyed, where will we stand for the day of judgment? If the whole creation is going to be destroyed, where are we going to be? We're going to be on a different plane of reality. What does that mean? So he has to contend with these answers. And this book, I've only just started it. His introduction is about 10 pages, just introductory notes and everything else. Then when he gets to the questions, this is, we're looking at what could be a class in the future, because these 8 questions, they cover not only what he's saying, but it's how he covers other topics. Because there's other things in these questions that he answers that other people will think about. Another question that he covers in this text is how can one keep concentration in the Salah? How can one better what's known as hudur al-qalb, presence of heart? He talks about these types of things. And there's no hocus pocus to it. They're well-known Sunnah methods and principles of how one guards oneself. When the Imam died in the year 1189 Hijri, he was buried in the family crypt. And he's not that far from Imam Wafiquddin ibn Qudama, from his crypt and his grave. He's not that far from. And the Qadumis and all these other family members. And these Imams, their graves are in the shadow of the warring and the conflict occurring between Palestinians and Israelis. It's in the shadow of it. Now they have disturbed the graves of Shaddad ibn Aus. That is now Shaddad ibn Aus Street in Israel. They've shifted the bodies and disturbed the graves of these many companions. These 2 bookends represent a first-hand or a bird's eye view of what the Palestinians gave us in knowledge, but also how they embraced Islam, how Islam came to them. They were a people urbane, steeped in knowledge, steeped in the wisdom of the ancients, independent-minded, independent thinking. So when Islam came to them, once they became Muslim, they said, okay, now that we've become Muslim, give us the full guide of what it is we need to do so we can carry out the obligations. We want to know. Tell us let us know what to do so we can do it. They didn't say, I don't know what my wife is going to say about this when I get home. What's my family going to say? What will my mother say? What will the wider society say? SubhanAllah, how are we going to do this? No. When you get a monastery, if you get a chance to look at the size of Al-Jami' Al-Salahi Al-Kabir, the Jami' Al-Salahi Al-Kabir Masjid, if you get a chance to look at the size of that thing, there must have been easily thousands of people in there that converted at once. At once. So, let us then look at the scholarly history of Imam al-Safarini before we close. So Imam al-Safarini wrote more than 20 books. He wrote a commentary on Dalil al-Talib, which is still in manuscript form. Some scholars say it's preserved in one collection. Some scholars say it's lost in another collection. He wrote a book about the dangers of talfiq, which are people that take rulings from other schools and they make hodgepodges and they join together many things and they sort of mix everything together. He wrote a book on At-Tahqiq fi Batlan al-Talfiq, the research into the falsehood of talfiq. He wrote another book on istighfar, seeking Allah's forgiveness. It's 189 pages, this book, because it's covering not only istighfar but also the ahadith on it. So he gives the takhrij of the hadith, which is really good for us because we're hadith lovers now in terms of, I'm looking for Hasan and Sahih, and yes, it's Hasan li ghayrihi, and we're into that stuff now. So it's the perfect book for fanatics like us. He's then got another book on clarifying the major kufr of the one who abandons all 5 prayers and the warning from doing it. He has another book called The Zuhud of Imam Ahmed. The Zuhud of Imam Ahmed. So this is talking about Imam Ahmed's personal practice, what we call tasawwuf now. Imam Ahmed called it Zuhud. So his personal practice, his day-to-day affairs of his different states of his heart. How Imam Ahmed was able to conquer over the lower states, so forth. He's got another book called The Seerah for Beginners. So this book, The Seerah for Beginners, is a rhyming couplet. So little children can learn this. They can memorize names. They can memorize events. And it's done in a clever rhyming style, which is fun. And so he's done this and left this behind as a standard. He then went through the books of Imam Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid Al-Maqdisi, who is the cousin of Umar ibn Qudama. He went through his books and wrote commentaries on all of his hadith books. So he's got a commentary on Umdat al-Ahkam, which is 11 volumes. Big mammoth commentary. Going through the discussion on each hadith, breaking down each hadith, and then giving any other narrations of that same hadith, doing the takhrij of it. Which again, for fanatics like us, that is wonderful. Further to this, the Imam also wrote a book on that was just composed of rulings that he gave on diverse topics. Rulings on diverse topics. Now, as his personal practice, he regularly fasted the fast of Dawood. So Imam al-Safarini's regular practice was fasting the fast of Dawood. And he would pray 60 nafil rak'ah throughout his day. 60 nafil rak'ah throughout his day, or sometimes 60 every night. Now, further to this, he also gave greatly in charity and avoided the kings. He wrote copious amounts of poetry, as he was an accomplished poet. And out of all of his different gifts, one of them was he opened his home to the weak and downtrodden and anyone who came to visit him. So he wasn't the type to, if somebody came to his home, he didn't tell them go back or you can't be here. He let everyone into his home. His door was always open. So he was generous. He was kareem. Right? He left behind wives and children. He had more than one wife. He left behind children. But his knowledge quest gave him a rank that is different to the rank of others, because he was dedicated to the knowledge, dedicated to preserving it and protecting it. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He make us among those who take on the knowledge, then we preserve it and we protect it in the same way that these men did. So we say Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk innahu ghafurur rahim hamid rahimin. So this concludes sort of our presentation on the two bookend scholars of Palestine. I wanted to present this because of just the urgency of what's going on in the West Bank and just the dire straits that the brothers and sisters find themselves in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we've already read the book. We know that victory is going to come in the end, but we don't know how long it will take, and we don't know what type of further trials we might have to endure before this all winds itself down. We've not been given an exact timetable in terms of the exact year we've been told. Now, are there any questions over what we've covered so far today in terms of Palestine, these two bookend scholars, their rank, their qualities, their goodness, what's come from them? Any questions? I want to take just a few moments just to reflect on something. Maybe I mentioned something about them, or I neglected to mention something. Maybe a date of birth, date of death, or maybe their written legacy. Maybe I didn't mention all their legacy. Yes.
Do you know the book that Imam Abdul Wahid wrote, At-Tabsirah fi us-Saalih?
Yes.
Could you talk more about what that book was about?
Okay. All right. Good question. So this statement is to speak a little bit more about the book that Imam Abdul Wahid Ash-Shirazi wrote, rahimahullah. The book At-Tabsirah fi us-Saalih is a comprehensive book of theology. It's a comprehensive book of theology as well as righteous actions. So in that book, he covers everything from belief in the names and attributes of Allah, all the way to the end where he talks about the companions, how we should believe about them, the rulers, and so on and so forth. But then within that, he also mixes in things about conduct. So how one should treat his parents, how one should treat wives, how one should be. So for him, because again, he's looking at these Justinians, for them, conduct is also part of theology, because it's a proof that you believe rightly, that you have good conduct. So he includes this inside of this. Okay, well, we better include that because they're coming from that background of saying, okay, well, because they're coming from the two standards, which are the two orthos, orthodoxis and orthopraxis. Orthodoxis is right belief. Orthopraxis is right action. So if someone has right belief, they have right action. But if someone has wrong belief, they're a heretic, and thus their actions will be wrong. So he said, okay, well, I need to include something that will have all these things in here. So he put together this book for their examination. It's been printed. And the book is it's 650 pages, I think. But it includes, the complete theology. You're not going to find anything in there new. You're just going to find a lot of ayat, a lot of hadith, because their minds were ready for this, because they're coming from a very rarefied, strict, scholarly background, and that's what they want. So he says, okay, well, then we'll give you all these hadith, we'll give you all these ayat, we'll give you all these, okay, fine, we're ready for that. Whereas someone looking for something to make hifl of would do like the Lum'a or the Mukhtasar of Ifada or something like that. But someone would use that book, the Tabsirah, is like a reference work. Right? So when you go into like a deeper class on creed or topics on creed where you want to have a whole bunch of evidences to hand, then you throw that in and say, oh, well, look at these. Right? Have a whole bunch of evidences. Here you go, right? There's a whole bunch right here. Right? You use those as your building block. And that's what he left behind for them. His other book, which is in fiqh, again, is really huge and monstrous, where he introduces like disputes in fiqh, and it's like, well, these are learners. These are new learners. Yeah, but if you look at the background that they're coming from, which is stringent, severe, they have many privations against themselves, they're eating once a day, they're willing to take on a really severe, let's do it. So he wrote something just for them, something that normally, say, an advanced student enters at the end of his studies, they want it at the beginning of theirs, because they said, we're ready for everything. We've already been as far as we can possibly get in Christianity. We're not going to be overwhelmed by having to study. We've forsworn our previous lives for a life of study, so we might as well just put it all out there for us. So that was given to them. He wrote about another 3 or 4 other books, but the Tafsirah covers those topics. There's another one that's got a whole bunch of other footnotes that other things in it. That's like 3 volumes, but the one without all the footnotes, it's about 650 pages. So it's a very good text of, say, intermediate theology and introducing other things in, like, where the Imam says, if you truly believe rightly, then you will make sure to pray your salah on time. And if you truly believe rightly, you will make sure that you don't mistreat your wives, because this is a proof of right creed. And if you really believe rightly, you will, he has all these little things in there. So I think it's a very good text for people that live a very unctuous lifestyle and just want to say, okay, just give me a guide that I can just hold on to, and that's it now. Because these are people living by themselves with their families, where we live here and that's it. We're never leaving here. Just give me something like, okay, here, take this. So if you're in the daytime and you have some moments where you're not harvesting vegetables, or you're not irrigating the land or whatever else, you read these as sections. So it became part of pretty much their curriculum. So they replaced the curriculum that they had with this. Any other questions? Question? No? Okay, so we'll close here, inshallah. And next week we'll be returning back to our book of Hadith. We'll be back on our normal schedule with Imam Abdul Sufyan Al-Qadumi rahimahullah, who again is a recipient of Imam As-Safanini's legacy, because Isa Al-Qadumi, his great-grandfather, is his student. So he's a recipient of this knowledge, right? And he is the Sheikh of Mustafa Al-Shati. So it's like that's the link with the Shatis now. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك واشهد ان لا اله الا انت استغفرك واتوب اليك انه غفور رحيم 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 ولا اله الا الله والسلام عليكم.